There's a lot of information that we're going to try to cover in a short period of time today, and to try to keep me organized so that we can get the most bang out of the buck. I will refer to some of my notes, but again, welcome. And to begin with, as we look at water, one of the features that I'm not sure you've ever reflected upon seriously is the fact that water is critical to every element of life. There's nothing on this planet, in fact in this universe, that does not depend on water. Today we're going to direct our activities to how, in particular, water has an impact on our bodies as humans, and perhaps to begin to evaluate it as a healthy thing that is more than just some clear liquid that is convenient and you get a thirst for, but that it has some activity. And in fact, the word bioavailability, or water that's available to you as a living entity, is the approach that we're going to take today. Now, if we start off and get a sense of what are these differences in water, and what's in my water? I mean, to most of this audience, you at least have some elementary knowledge of water, but we're going to just start from the beginning and say, in many of the towns, including this one, but more appropriately across the United States, things are added to the water to attempt to clean it. And so for most of this century, what has happened is that they had begun to add chlorine to the water. Now, for many of you say, so what's wrong with that? In fact, I have a swimming pool and I have chlorine in my swimming pool and I take a shower every day. I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, we're here in the United States and we have excellent water. And of course the government wouldn't bother us here in terms of putting something in the water that might be injurious. I say to you that this has not been a conscious attempt to make you sick or to have an impact on yourselves. The problem we're faced with today is that the government doesn't know what else to use. So even as we back up for just a minute and look at these pristine rivers and streams that we have in this region, and in the Pacific Northwest, we get a lot of rain, so there is a lot of water around. And we look at the beautiful Columbia River Basin and say, but of course we have good water here, and we have pristine rivers, and we have a beautiful mountain here that gives off a lot of water, that supplies a lot of the area. But how many of you remember about a year and a half ago, it wasn't that big in the news, but there were reports about a science class. This was a group of high school kids that decided to look at the rivers and streams as part of their science project. And in the course of that, they started running across all these little frogs with deformities. They saw so many that everybody got excited about it, and it became a national issue, to the point that what they were seeing, if you can imagine, were frogs with 3 eyes and 7 legs and 2 extra organs and things missing. And you could say, so, okay, that's a frog. Wait a minute, what significance does that have to me? Number one, we found them in our little rivers and streams here in the Pacific Northwest. They also found them in the Thousand Lakes in Minnesota, which are coming off of supposedly some pretty pristine waters over the Canadian border. These were in areas where we thought at least they would have clean water. I mean, if I had to pick a state like perhaps New Jersey, where it's been noted that the water has been bad for years, or the District of Columbia, where they don't know what in the devil they're going to do with the water there, or areas which are heavily populated, you know, we would perhaps think that maybe I'd have a little dirty water there, but even there, people don't realize just how bad their drinking water is. When I've spoken to people from the Department of Energy, one of whom I know rather closely, and when she came to visit out here, she came with her bottle of water. And I said, well, you don't need to bring bottled water. This was a couple years ago. You don't need to bring bottled water out here. We have excellent water. She says, oh, no, it doesn't work that way. Anywhere we travel in the United States, we take our bottled water. He says, are you aware that in the state of South Carolina, right at the Georgia border, that the water almost lights up and irradiates when, if you were to put something that would allow the radiation to show. Do you realize that here in Washington State you have the largest Superfund in the United States in terms of cleaning up the water, the groundwater, as secondary to Hansford, and what took place there in the building of nuclear submarines and for a nuclear power plant? In fact, if we back up just a minute, we find that there is, since 1995, and I don't watch that much TV, but on occasion something says turn the set on, and I walked into my house one day in 1995, July of 1995, it says turn the TV on. And just at that moment, the Center for Communicable Diseases was making an announcement that I just happened to hear. It was only on for one day, so they had done their public duty to announce to the public what they wanted to say. And in that broadcast, they noted that there was no safe drinking water left in the United States. Now, people begin to say, well, I have a well, and I have excellent water because I don't have chlorine and fluoride in my water. Wrong. Most of the tributaries of the Columbia are in trouble. And if the frogs aren't news enough to you that there's a problem, I tell you, take another look. Now, when we look at those frogs, again, why are these frogs so important? If you begin to go into the coal mines around the world and they're worried about noxious gases or toxic gases being eliminated, the old rule was to send in a canary. The canary didn't come out. The canary died. You knew you didn't go in. Well, the frogs are comparable to those canaries when we speak of the water system. They're that sensitive to critical changes in the water, enough to say to you, don't go into the water or don't drink that water. Our water is bad. And not to scare you and not to send you into a depression about it, if I said to you that the United States did not have enough money to meet the needs to change the water system, the onus then comes on us in individual families to decide what am I going to do for my family? What am I going to do to make sure that my water is tolerable? When I think of little babies, and I know that these babies are totally dependent upon what I feed them and what I give them to drink for their life. And if you come from that perspective, you get a sense of the responsibility you have for your family in terms of knowing and understanding what's in your water and what you can do about it. Now, we've created a pretty grim picture here, but to say that there are things that can change your water and make it more healthy, make it so that your body can absorb it and use it and help you to become healthy, that's what we're about today. So let's take a closer look at this chlorine that we mentioned here. And many of you were around during the First World War. And do you remember the use of gas masks by the troops in Europe with the First World War? That was to prevent the chlorine gas that was used in an attempt to use biological warfare with the troops during the First World War. It was chlorine gas they used. Well, guess what, folks? That same chlorine gas is generated every time you take a shower. And in fact, you inhale more chlorine taking a shower than you do even drinking 8 glasses of it a day. Probably haven't thought about that and its impacts on your lungs. Nevertheless, getting into a swimming pool and swimming in chlorine, you absorb through your skin, the largest organ in your body, chlorine. Things you probably never even reflected on. Well, when I put that chlorine with the body, and let's take a vegetarian to begin with, and say, well, I only eat vegetables, I can't imagine anything toxic would interfere with my body. Well, when vegetables decay in the body and they mix with chlorine, they turn into another compound. And the one that they turn into is trihalomethane. And you can say, okay, so what's trihalomethane? How many of you take your clothes to the cleaners to get them clean? You have the occasion to go to the cleaners, okay? Well, the cleaning fluid that they use to clean your clothes is trihalomethane. So you can imagine that what you're introducing to your body is trihalomethane, or cleaning fluid. Terrible thought. The cancerous effects of trihalomethane have been very well documented. And you say, well, I don't understand. Why would they do this? Well, let's take another example, because you're not vegetarian. So we'll make you a meat eater. And you say, well, I don't have any problems with that. Wrong. That decaying meat stuff in your bowel, for all of you that have one bowel movement a week or one bowel movement every other day, turns into a fine paste in the digestive tract. And that paste deposits along the blood vessels and stiffens or hardens the blood vessels. So instead of being flexible pipes, we've now got these hard steel-type pipes within our system. And you wonder about where your high blood pressure came from. You wonder about hardening of the arteries and what's going on in your heart. Let's try a little chlorine in your system in terms of not being able to utilize or move out some of the things in your bowels. You know, the old middle-aged spread that guys take for granted is something that's supposed to happen. Wrong. A lot of that, the hardening that's going on there, is because of the elements that are in water itself. Then we add, what else do we have there? Well, the government has already decided that it can't use chlorine. I mean, they can't add any more chlorine to the water. They recognize that there are a lot of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that they would like to kill. But if they add more chlorine, they know that they're stepping into some very toxic levels. So what are they adding additionally to make things more, or to make them more safe so that they're not as dangerous from an infectious disease perspective? Guess what they're adding, folks? Mercury. Now, for all of you that know about the old amalgam scenario in terms of not having amalgam in your teeth and how it reacts with the body, you know the toxic nature of mercury being in the system. And guess what else? They're not required to tell you that they have mercury in the water. The laws are written so they only have to tell you about chlorine. They don't have to tell you about mercury. In Michigan, in Washington State, and Washington, D.C., mercury is added to the water systems. So you get an idea that perhaps it's not the safest thing in the world to be drinking at a time when I'm saying to you, drink more water. In fact, that's what got me into this in the first place. You know, I got across to my patients that, yes, you should drink more water. And then they turned back to me and said, okay, doc, what water are we going to drink? And I got stumped. And it really has taken me around the world to try to find some of the best waters and the best things to use in your water that will help you have safe and clean water. Now, what about the old fluoride scare? What in the dickens is going on with fluoride? There have been debates back and forth. There have been blow-ups in different legislatures as to whether or not fluoride should be used. The study that originally talked about fluoride came about during the 1930s, and it was done at the Carnegie Mellon Institute. Now, Carnegie Mellon happens to be one of the biggest benefactors of the aluminum industry, with Alcoa aluminum. The aluminum industry has a problem. They don't know what to do with the byproducts of making aluminum. And in fact, around any aluminum plant, you'll find there's no vegetation for miles. And any animals that happen to be grazing in farms or whatever near an aluminum plant, you'll find dies and ages very fast. Well, the same thing happens to you if you're exposed to fluoride. Your body will age doubly fast. So a 30-year-old will look like they're 60 years old. And in areas of the world where fluoride is naturally, these people do age very, very fast. In addition to that, going back to that study which says we should add fluoride to the water because it will prevent tooth decay in children. Wrong. When they tried to repeat that study, and that study was done by a benefactor of the aluminum industry at Carnegie Mellon, when they tried to repeat that study, they found it was not correct. And in fact, it caused further decay of the teeth. In other words, it enhanced decay of the teeth rather than preventing decays. I don't know if you're aware, but fluoride is the chemical that's used, that's injected into zoo animals and the bulls and the bullfighting rings of Spain to keep them docile. In Russia, while the Iron Curtain was still down, I don't know if they're still doing it or not, but they added fluoride to the drinking water of all the prisoners to keep them under control. I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why fluoride perhaps is being added to our drinking water, but it's there. Lead, I think many of you are familiar with the toxicity of lead. In many of the older cities, the pipes were all made out of lead. Or where the pipes are joined together, lead was used by the plumbers to keep leaks. The soldering of the pipes in the middle, lead was used. Now, lead has been known for years in terms of its toxicity to the brain. It goes directly to the brain and can be a cause for death. Now, many of these elements are very, very toxic, and the people that absorb them the most are fast-growing tissue, which would be our children. So that often we see the toxicity in the children with many of these heavy metals and the gases. So you want to be aware of that. In fact, there was just a year ago an announcement in the Seattle system of the worry about lead in its water systems. It's very high in a number of the old houses in Seattle. There are a number of old houses here in this area. So don't think you're out of it just simply because you don't live in a big city. Many of the old farmhouses still have lead as the basic pipes that they use, the old galvanized pipes, or the solder used in the pipes are made of lead. So you may want to, take note of that. Now, I thought that we'd move from there, and let me just say, we're in a world where the word filter versus purification system, as we move into this new century, are the terms that we're switching from. To the American public, first question they usually ask is, what kind of filter is this? And they've gotten pretty used to looking at carbon filters and looking at water conditioners and things being added to the water, okay? That's old technology. That's the technology of the 70s and the 80s. Yes, charcoal type filters will take out odors, will take out smells, will take out basically gas types of materials and their smell from the water. But that's all they do. You want to know about what things will actually convert the water into a drinkable or to a live thing that you can absorb into the body. About 25 years ago, and through this community, we had people very much interested in BEV water. And what did BEV water mean? BEV stands for Bioelectric Vincent, standing for Dr. Vincent's name out of France. He decided to come up with a standard that could be used for measuring how toxic water was. And so things were divided into what we call BEV units. Yes. In that, he used distilled water as the basic water to measure all waters by. And it's simply a standard that says if I have a particular BEV number of units and that water is pure, that water is clean, it is drinkable. Reverse osmosis here, which we have on the screen, to give you an example of things that are looked at, pH and resistance or RH factor. And again, as it is gauged against distilled water. Reverse osmosis is a good way of purifying your water. The only problem we have with reverse osmosis is that it takes everything out of the water. And what's left after reverse osmosis is what we call in the water industry dead water. It does nothing, it gives nothing back to the body. So that we've got a water that's clean, but it's just sort of sitting there. It will not interact with your cells. As you can see, and this is in BEV units with reverse osmosis, the pH usually will range anywhere from 5.3 to 6.8. The RH factor is 25 to 29. We'll come back to the electrolysis portion of this, but electrolysis being a process that is used to clean up water, you can see the difference here in terms of the RH factor and the pH. It's almost 3,000-fold stronger than with a reverse osmosis unit. Now, I bring up reverse osmosis because the government is recommending to you that you use RO water, RO standing for reverse osmosis, or boil your water. Now, here's the problem with boiling. When you boil your water, all you're doing, well, you will hit organisms that die at high temperatures. And I put it that way because with some of the mutations and some of the bacteria, viruses, and fungi, they're developing skins that are so hard that boiling the water doesn't even touch them. So that's one thing. Number two, like we talked about the trihalomethanes, gases like that get concentrated when you boil them. So in fact, as well as some of those heavy metals. So all you're doing is concentrating them, and they're all in the bottom of your bottom of your pot or whatever it is that you boiled with. So that doesn't work. But that's what the government to date has recommended to folks to do. Boil your water. No good. Okay. As we move from that into the next spectrum of things, and we start going into what other things do we need to look at in the water, let's take a look at pH, which was one of those items on that list in terms of looking at purity. Now here in this area, and I have this beautiful chart behind me because many of you have probably seen it and not paid too much attention to it. This is a chart that reflects the aquifer here in this region. Now, what is an aquifer? That's a particular bowl, we'll use that term, that all the groundwater seeps into. So this particular aquifer is a very large one. And the bowl is very large, and all of your water comes from that aquifer. Now, this is a very peculiar aquifer in that it's the type of aquifer that whatever's on the surface gets into the groundwater or gets into that bowl. So whether I'm over in Tumwater or I'm here in Yelm, anything on the surface, so somebody pours oil down a drain here or in Lacey, it's going to get into that bowl and be a factor that we draw our water from. Now, all the pink areas up there are areas that are in trouble. This aquifer is in trouble as it relates to acidity, as it relates to what's on the surface getting into the bottom. This is from the state. This chart was given out by the state officials. When I started asking questions about, I said to them, I'm probably the only one in this entire region that tests their water 2 or 3 times a day. Why is our water having a pH below 7.0? And 7.0 is where it's a neutral point. It's where you want to have your drinking water, to at least be at 7.0. And in testing, we were getting anywhere from 6.3 to 7.3. And I wanted to know, why is our water so acid there? They couldn't answer me. They still don't know. But it's a problem. If I look at pH on another perspective, how much acid is in the water, and I go to Long Island, New York, I find just the opposite. There we have pHs at 8.5, 8.0. And I said, wow, okay, so is this going to be great water here? What's going on? You know, it's very interesting to me. I just call them coinkydinks. That I just happened to be in the right places at the right time. And the Sunday while I was there, the newspaper in New York just happened to run an article on the groundwater on Long Island. And the Brookhaven Institute is located and has been based there for over 45 years in Long Island. And the problem is they had been dumping some of their chemicals into the ground. And the groundwater was contaminated. Contaminated so badly that the government had, of course, taken measures by putting lime into the water to try to get the pH up. And so the pH standardly was 8.5. But I knew from some of the patients that I had there that, as an example, we had kids with cleft palates in one square block. I'm sorry, correct on that. In one hospital, within a 1-year period, 11 children were born with cleft palate. Now, the chances of that happening by accident are like 1 in a million are the normal numbers for that. 11 children in one hospital, all coming from the same geographical area, had cleft palate. Goes even further. In one block, within 1 year, 11 women had breast cancer. All, again, on Long Island. I say there's something wrong here. Just your good old common sense tells you there's something common here that's factoring in. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But you can see that being too acidic and being too alkaline can have its problems. So you don't necessarily want to do that. In Arizona and New Mexico right now, they have the problem of too much alkalinity. In fact, their water's starting at 7.8 and going up. And people are having problems from too much alkalinity in their water. So this is a vast country here. Waters will vary in different regions, and that needs to be kept in mind. Now, I put up here this equation called the equation of life, because this is an equation that was rediscovered by Dr. Carey Reams shortly after the turn of the century. Now, equation of life, because this holds for humans, it holds for plants, and it holds for animals. This is a basic equation of life. If the soil is too acid, if the soil is too alkaline, disease will enter the plants grown in that soil, or they will be weak. If things are balanced, you'll get a tremendous yield, and again, the plants will be strong. The same thing happens with animals. Their pH. As long as they fall along this equation, they will be free of disease. And you'll note there that we are looking at the pH of the urine and the pH of the saliva, which is reflective of the buildup in the body, how we break down our foodstuffs and how we take these foodstuffs and try to make them incorporate them into our bodies. So pH ideally should be 6.4 in both of those elements in order for the body to be diseased. Now, it doesn't rely totally on pH, because as you look at glucose here, it's also how the body handles carbohydrates, how it handles mineral salts, and also when I look at nitrates and ammonia, how we break down flesh protein, which would be meat, seafood, and poultry, and on the nitrate side, and as we look at ammonia, how we handle vegetable protein. Next slide, please. Now, as we look at this and showing you the significance of that, we find that in this narrow pH of 6.4, we absorb all the minerals. And as we move away from that pH of 6.4, we find that there are certain minerals we can't absorb. So as an example, if we look at the next slide, but note before we change that, it's a little bit difficult to see from a different distance, that we're at both ends of the spectrum here. If you're too acid, you don't absorb them, but also if you're too alkaline, you can't absorb them. And okay, you'll note there that at a pH of 5.8 is where we begin to absorb calcium. So that if your body does not have a pH, meaning your urine and saliva does not have a pH of at least 5.8, you can't absorb calcium. And as we go on today, we'll let you figure out the significance of being able to absorb that calcium. But if I look at manganese, which you can absorb until you have a pH of 6.0. If you look at eggs and sperm, there's no egg or sperm that will develop, whether it's in a peach or whether it's in you, if you do not have sufficient quantities of manganese in the body. Well, you can't even absorb manganese until you have a pH of at least 6.0. So we wonder about the number of infertile young women and men we have out there anxiously trying to have children and having difficulty producing viable eggs and sperm. Many of them are too acidic, and cannot absorb enough manganese to even produce sperm and eggs that would be viable. Then you add to that what we said earlier in terms of the frogs. If the frog eggs and sperm are bringing up mutations and defects, what do you think is going to happen to your sperm and your eggs if you're drinking the same water? You get an idea that water isn't just a casual little thing here that you can see through when you hold up a glass. There's got to be more to it than that. Okay, now, you say to me, Doc, when I look at these minerals here, what significance is that? So I can't absorb, above the sperm and the egg situation, or I can't absorb calcium. What else does it mean? We can go on to the next slide with the tube. If I cannot absorb my minerals, I like to put the minerals or make them tantamount to air in an inner tube. If I can't get enough air, if I can't get enough minerals to a particular organ, then I'm going to suddenly get this little outpouching on the side of the organ. Now, in a human body or in an animal, that would be tantamount to a cyst. This little outpouch on the side of the inner tube. I keep going along. This lasts for, say, a year. Now I've got a permanent outpouching on the side of that inner tube, on the side of that organ. That would be tantamount to a tumor. And all of that is because I can't get sufficient minerals to those organs. The one we can see, the biggest organ we got is our skin. So you start seeing cysts and things on your skin, imagine what the other organs look like. And each organ has a different percentage of minerals that it needs in order for it to grow or to be, in peak performance. So let's say the brain says, well, I like a lot of calcium and I like a little potassium, and let's see, throw in a little magnesium. That I need to just have my brain function. And if not,